In America, there's a burglary every 11 seconds, an armed robbery every 65 seconds, a murder every 24 minutes.
On YouTube, 300 hours of video are uploaded every minute, 5 billion videos are viewed per day, and 20% of people who start a video will leave after the first 10 seconds. Since you're not one of those, how about hitting that like button to help support the channel? This matchstick is really hard to speak with, by the way. But in today's video, we're going to talk about the 1986 Stallone action fest Cobra. I've always liked to think of this film as having occurred in an alternate universe, the Rambo universe. Do you know how easily that could have been a Rambo movie? For example, in First Blood, imagine if Sheriff Teasel, instead of harassing Rambo, ended up recruiting him to be a police officer. It's not so far-fetched. He did offer to take him to that other restaurant in the other town. They could have talked about job opportunities over a cup of coffee. So First Blood could have ended up becoming Police Academy, Rambo First Blood Part 2 could have ended up becoming Cobra, and Rambo 3 would have ended up becoming Copland. On second thought, maybe Sheriff Teasel's decision wasn't so bad after all. So the universe Cobra did end up taking place in was Stallone's version of what he thought Beverly Hills Cop should have been, and we're going to talk all about that and other fun stuff related to this film, so stay tuned. Oh, by the way, those crime stats Cobra gave during the opening narration were far too high, even by 1986 standards. But it's not like they had the internet back then to fact check. But even if they did, there's so much misinformation out there anyway, so I'm not even sure it would have mattered. As far as the character goes,
Stallone is
Marion Cobretti.
In an interview, Sylvester Stallone described the character of Marion Cobretti as Bruce Springsteen with a badge. Seems like everybody was talking about Bruce Springsteen back then.
What's the difference if Bruce Springsteen is a Shidoshi?
The name Marion, by the way, was chosen by Stallone because he envisioned Cobra as something of a modern-day cowboy and so named him after the most iconic big-screen cowboy of them all, John Wayne, whose real name was Marion.
It's kind of tough growing up with, don't you think? I always wanted to have a tougher one myself.
Like what?
Alice.
Cobra's part of the so-called zombie squad.
Cobra, like Monty says, you're on the zombie squad. You're a specialist that does a job nobody wants, all right?
Sylvester Stallone said he got the idea for the LAPD zombie squad from a real-life zombie squad in Belgium, comprised of cops who go out at night and handle crazed criminals on their own terms. The film Cobra was originally conceived from ideas Sylvester Stallone had during pre-production for Beverly Hills Cop, a screenplay he heavily revised. He wanted to make Beverly Hills Cop less comedic and more action-oriented to better suit himself as the lead. However, the studio Warner Brothers ended up rejecting his ideas as they felt the picture would end up being far too expensive to produce. One idea, for example, Stallone said during an interview, would have been the finale. In his version of Beverly Hills Cop, his character would end up in a stolen Lamborghini playing chicken with an oncoming freight train driven by the ultra-slimy bad guy. Is it just me, or does that seem like a really bad idea? Not from a cinematic perspective, but rather a rational one. It just doesn't seem like a good idea to play chicken with a freight train, since a freight train can't exactly just turn and veer off like a car can. Seems like a losing proposition.
It's suicide! You can't win!
Adrian's right, this is not a game of chicken you could ever win. Interesting side note, by the way, you'd think Stallone would pretty much be able to get any movie he wanted made after the success of Rocky IV and Rambo II in 1985, which were the number 2 and 3 highest grossing films at the box office that year. Cobra would see release the following year in 1986, however his ideas for Beverly Hills Cop occurred prior to 1985, as that film would see release in 1984. So that's important to keep in mind. Warner Brothers very well may have greenlit his version of Beverly Hills Cop after Stallone's success in 1985. Both Cobra and Beverly Hills Cop would see the main characters serve as street-smart, freewheeling cops in search of a killer, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. Stallone and Cobra would be a lot more like Judge Dredd.
I am the law!
I'd personally much rather be arrested by Axel Foley over Cobra, unless I wanted to pursue a lawsuit, of course.
Did you use unnecessary force?
I used everything I had.
Beverly Hills Cop's revised screenplay would not be the only source material used for the film Cobra. That actually goes back to the 1978 novel by Paula Gosling called A Running Duck, which has also been published as Fair Game, which would later become a William Baldwin and Cindy Crawford film in the mid-90s, sharing the title Fair Game. In the novel, the female character Claire Randall meets a man in a car park by helping him to recover papers that spilled from his briefcase. She thought no more about it, but the police did, because the man was a paid assassin and had never been seen. Now Claire knows what he looks like, and her killer already knows she must be eliminated. A cop is assigned to protect her, and they end up falling for each other. It's worth noting that the novel was a critical hit, which won the John Creasy Award for the best first novel of the year. That basic plot is essentially kept in both films, but they couldn't be more different. aside from both starring a real-life supermodel as a female lead, Brigitte Nielsen in Cobra, and of course Cindy Crawford in Fair Game. Cobra did such a great job with creating a unique character, which makes sense since the film is named after him. There's so much about him that is iconic, from his aviator sunglasses to the matchstick and his gun with Cobra gun grips, the red laser scope. Oh, and let's not forget his car with the vanity plate Awesome 50, a custom-built 1950 Mercury, which was actually the car Sylvester Stallone personally owned. All of these memorable characteristics are a big reason why so many people still talk about the character Cobra and this film today. Whereas I never hear anybody bring up Fair Game in a conversation. I'm pretty sure no one even remembers William Baldwin's character's name in that film. What people likely would remember though is Cindy Crawford's nude scene, as I'm sure that likely helped sell more than a few tickets. Speaking of ticket sales, Cobra was considered a box office disappointment at the time, but that's only because it was compared with Stallone's previous two efforts the year prior, Rocky IV and Rambo First Blood Part 2. The bar was just set too high. Those were the number 2 and 3 highest grossing films in '85, as I mentioned earlier. Cobra did end up grossing over $12.5 million in its opening weekend, which was the largest opening weekend in history for Warner Brothers and the Cannon Group at the time. Worldwide, it earned over $160 million on its $25 million budget, which was over 6 times its budget. Inflation adjusted, that's over $386 million, so I'd say it was a hit. As far as the Cannon Film Group goes, the producers Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus had managed to talk Stallone into doing a 2-picture deal, the other film being 1987's Over the Top, but they lacked the finances to hire a star as expensive as Stallone, so entered into an agreement with Warner Brothers to co-fund and distribute the movies. The Cannon logo doesn't actually appear anywhere during the film's opening or closing credits or on any of the publicity materials. It does end like a traditional Cannon film, however, with the film's title frozen in the middle of the screen after the credits have stopped rolling, but does not have the usual Cannon logo underneath it. Golan and Globus received only an on-screen production credit, reportedly because it was primarily a Warner Brothers production that gave them a producing credit in return for voiding a prior agreement they had with Stallone. The most seasoned guy on the set was cinematographer Rick Waite, whose work goes back to the early 70s. The man clearly knows how to shoot action. After Cobra, he worked with Steven Seagal several times, being director of photography on Marked for Death, Out for Justice, and On Deadly Ground. He'd also shoot the Brandon Lee film Rapid Fire. At one point during filming, Sylvester Stallone complained to the cinematographer Rick Waite that they were falling behind and said he and his crew needed to work harder. Waite responded by saying that if Stallone, quote, gets his hands off Brigitte Nielsen's ass and stops showing off to his bodyguards, maybe they wouldn't have a problem with time.
She got a great ass!
Stallone was shocked that somebody would talk to him that way, but he did manage to tone down his ego for a few weeks. Ego is an interesting thing and no one's above it. It's a very human thing. Now, picture a guy who's the biggest box office star in the world, coming off of the number 2 and 3 largest movies onto the set of his next film.
Call the Cobra.
Which happens to be Cobra. He's just married a 22-year-old supermodel, which Stallone would have been around 39 when they shot the film.
All for the glorification of your massive ego!
I'm not really surprised that marriage didn't work out, by the way. Little bit of an age gap there. But the ego is an unhealthy belief in our own importance, the need to be better than, more than, and recognized for. A sense of superiority.
How bad is it? It's bad.
That's not to say it's all negative, because the need to be better than and more than can propel an individual, whether in their career or relationship or really anything they feel is important in their life. I know a lot of us on this channel, for example, are either into lifting weights and or martial arts, and of course, since we're taking the time pursuing that, it's only natural to want to improve, so it could definitely be used in a positive way to help motivate a person and push them into achieving a higher degree of success in their chosen activity, but it's just important to remain grounded. Try to keep the ego in check and realize how lucky we are just to be able to pursue what's important to us. We have the freedom that a lot of people probably take for granted. They don't even realize it because they don't know anything different. It's all relative. But going back to Stallone, he got recognition and validation by way of box office receipts. And although film is a collaborative effort, he was much more than just the actor. Take Rocky IV, which he also wrote and directed, for example, and Rambo First Blood Part 2, which he revised off a script from James Cameron. And look at the characters he played in those. Heavyweight boxing champ of the world.
We held the greatest title in the whole world, baby.
Who arguably single-handedly ended the Cold War, and a super soldier who got a chance to actually win Vietnam.
Sir, do we get to win this time?
This time it's up to you.
So he had to take on the persona of those two characters. So going by that logic, and I know I just made a point about trying to remain grounded and keep one's ego in check, in this extreme example, I just don't see how anyone wouldn't end up having a massive ego because of it. How could that not go to your head? Now, I'm not justifying it, but realistically, I'm pretty sure that level of success would affect any one of us, at least for a little while. Didn't everything just seem bigger in the 80s, by the way? I just don't think you'll see, or at least it won't feel like anyone can reach that level that Stallone and Arnold had in the 80s. For example, The Rock just surpassed 200 million Instagram followers, and while he's extremely popular, he just doesn't seem to be on the same level as Stallone and Arnold were in their heyday. Let me know in comments, by the way, does that seem accurate, or am I just off in that assessment? Going back to cinematographer Rick Waite, he also confirmed a rumor that Stallone was a true director of the film, calling credited director George P. Cosmatos a good producer but a bad director. On paper, Cobra was technically directed by George P. Cosmatos, the same director that worked with Stallone the previous year in the hit Rambo First Blood Part 2. Aside from Rick Waite, several people involved in the film claim that while Sylvester Stallone was on set, he was in fact literally directing the film. Stallone mapped out and planned a lot of the shots. Cosmatos would just agree with Stallone on everything he wanted to do and stay out of his way. I mentioned something similar in my Hard Target video about Van Damme and director John Woo. It seems that the main star has so much power, they just often call the shots both literally and figuratively, which was something John Woo complained about at the time, since prior to Hard Target, he was making films in Hong Kong, where the director had all the power. As far as whether or not Cosmatos had a problem with Stallone taking the reins, it's hard to say. Though according to several actors involved in the production, when Sylvester Stallone was not on set, George P. Cosmatos acted like a tyrannical person to the cast and crew, which ended up rubbing many people the wrong way. Marco Rodriguez, who played the crazy psychopath that takes a grocery store hostage at the beginning of the film, was one such person. For example, he said, George would get upset to the point of exploding when he was not getting a particular performance. Rodriguez would counter that he was only, quote, doing what George asked of him. Speaking of Marco Rodriguez, kind of a funny story, because of Cobra,
I'm a hero of the new world.
You're a disease, and I'm the cure.
his nickname on several movies afterwards has been The Disease.
Like I have some sort of a disease. You have the disease. You have the disease.
Despite what Marco Rodriguez was told, George P. Cosmatos did tell Brian Thompson that he was glowing about Marco Rodriguez's performance as the supermarket killer, saying to him that he was so great and I hope you are like that too. This was said to inspire Thompson in his performance after the opening was filmed. Marco Rodriguez actually auditioned for the main character that Brian Thompson played, the Night Slasher, which I'm sure even put more pressure on Brian Thompson since he'd had to prove that the casting department made the right choice, especially since this was Thompson's first big movie role, which certainly wasn't easy to get as he had to audition 7 times before he was hired. On his 4th audition, he met Sylvester Stallone and both he and the director thought Thompson was too nice to play the role of Night Slasher. But after a screen test, he immediately got the job. Thompson repeatedly asked Stallone about his character Night Slasher, like how Stallone would want Thompson to play him, the character's background, his reasons for doing what he's doing. But Stallone wasn't interested in explaining Thompson's character, and he basically told him that he's evil because he's evil. In an unfortunate surprise for Thompson, when filming of the movie was finished, director George P. Cosmatos told Thompson, "You could have been good if you had listened to me." The knife used by the Night Slasher character was made for the film by knife designer Herman Schneider. Sylvester Stallone had asked Schneider to create a knife that audiences would never forget.
He really made a masterpiece. Sharpest knife, maybe the sharpest knife I've ever held. I've certainly never cut myself more than any other knife.
Speaking of getting cut, and this hurt the story as well as Thompson, the Night Slasher subplot was cut. Removing the subplot really was unfortunate, as a strong, memorable villain really goes a long way in how good a film ends up becoming. There were a couple of different reasons why a good portion of the film was cut during editing, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Watching the film as it is, it seems as if a string of seemingly unconnected and unmotivated random assaults on civilians occur, and it's easy to come to that conclusion. For example, how would the audience know that this woman driving her car is a weak member of society?
We kill the weak, so the strong survive.
Brian Thompson had the idea that the Night Slasher should have Polaroids and profiles of his victims in a way to let the audience know that these weren't just random killings, but rather targeted. This would have better helped in establishing the so-called New World Society that the Night Slasher ran. Kind of an interesting organization overall. I'm not sure exactly how they've been recruiting people, perhaps want ads in the local paper. This guy in the suit, for example, looks like he works in middle management, so he already has an opportunity to weed out the weak people at work. You'd think he'd have all the weeding out of people out of his system by the time he clocks out, but apparently not. The only exposition we really get during the film comes near its end when the Night Slasher and Cobra come face to face. For the Night Slasher's monologue in the final confrontation with Cobra, Brian Thompson did the scene with the script girl because Sylvester Stallone was off watching a basketball game on television. On an interesting side note, Brian Thompson had to buy his own ticket to see the film because he was not invited to the film's premiere by the film's producers or Warner Brothers, which still mystifies him to this day. To add insult to injury, he also ended up winning a Razzie Award for Best New Actor. For anyone who's not familiar with that award, that's something you don't want to win. The film was actually nominated for 6 in total, including Worst Picture, Worst Actor, Sylvester Stallone, Worst Actress, Brigitte Nielsen, and Worst Screenplay. Whoever's running the Razzies, by the way, just seems to have it out for Stallone. Since we've been talking about the villains in the film, movie villain staple Al Leong was initially cast as one of the lead villains. However, his role was eliminated following protests by an advocacy group that objected to the casting of an Asian villain. I'm sure Al would have been happy to work regardless of the role, and I've only ever seen him cast as a villain. He does have the honor of sharing the screen alongside both Jean-Claude Van Damme in Death Warrant and Brandon Lee in Rapid Fire, of course, playing the villain in both. But at least the advocacy group did not end up advocating him out of those films, as he put up some pretty entertaining fights. As far as the editing goes, several cuts had to be made in order to avoid an X rating due to graphic violence. For example, the first murder victim had her hand severed. There was an extended autopsy scene which included lingering shots of naked and mutilated bodies, more deaths of the townspeople during the climax, including a person getting hit in the face with an axe, and a longer death scene for Ingrid's photographer Dan, which included shots of him slipping on his own blood while trying to escape. Speaking of Dan, he's a true slimeball.
Look, I'd be sick not to want to sleep with you. Okay, then don't do it for me, do it for your career. It's not like I'm asking you to marry me. I'm not doing this for me, really. Look, I'm just trying to help you find happiness.
It's kind of funny to think about. When a lot of us watch a movie like Rocky or Bloodsport, we get inspired and motivated to train so we can be more like those characters. But I guess people like Harvey Weinstein who watch a movie like Cobra get inspired and motivated to be like Dan. Either way, both men met their karmic end. A very rare work print of the movie has circulated among fans, although most copies are poor quality. It has that 30 to 40 minutes of footage that was cut, including all those scenes I just mentioned, in addition to a great deal more plot to tell. Let me know in the comments section if any of you have seen it and what you think about it. Graphic violence aside, there was another reason the film was cut down from 2 hours to 87 minutes. There were concerns that the film might not be a hit, so cutting out the half hour would allow for more theatrical screenings per day. Cobra ended up opening in 2,131 theaters in the United States and Canada, breaking the movie industry's all-time record at the time, which was previously held by Rambo First Blood Part 2, which opened in 2,074 theaters. Speaking of editing, an interesting side note, the movie Fair Game was re-edited as well by Warner Brothers in post-production, but that's because a test audience disliked the original cut. Cobra was certainly a unique film. I've always remembered seeing the box art as a kid in the video store thinking, that's the coolest looking movie out there. It was kind of an odd one overall, combining over-the-top 80s action with horror elements. For example, take these shots of the night slasher stabbing his knife through the door. Watching that scene alone, you think you're watching a horror movie. As far as the action goes,
we've got a broad spectrum of all stunt where we have fire suit gags, we've got motorcycles, we've got car chases, we've got fist fights, we've had a high fall. So we hit almost all the high points of motion picture stunt work in this film.
Speaking of the car chase, I really like the scene when he does that 180-degree spin and machine gun blasts those baddies. How cool is that? There's a really cool montage in the film that plays over a Robert Tepper song, Angel in the City. Stallone used another one of Robert Tepper's songs a prior year during the montage in Rocky IV, No Easy Way Out. While Cobra's montage can't match that, which I'm not sure if any montage can match that, it is entertaining, though sort of an odd hodgepodge mix of Stallone combing the seedy underbelly of LA, Brigitte Nielsen modeling with robots. There's just a fascination with robots in the 80s.
Who's that? That's my girl.
And Brian Thompson as a killer doing his own thing. Another thing that really stood out about Cobra for me was that no one seems to have good parking etiquette, hero or villain. For example, the supermarket killer uses a handicapped parking space for his motorcycle, and Stallone has his own unique, though disrespectful way of parallel parking. And who can forget that guy with the lavalier microphone taped to his chest? I'll give him credit for not breaking character. And lastly, why is Cobra cutting pizza with scissors? It's already a slice. I don't think I've seen anyone cut food with scissors outside of a Korean restaurant, which is actually quite genius. You guys should try it sometime. It makes food prep a lot easier. Stallone has stated in interviews that Cobra should have been another franchise because the character was so cool, and that he blew it because his personal life got in the way. He's likely referring to his messy divorce with Brigitte Nielsen the year after Cobra was released. But what do you guys think about Cobra? There's talks of it coming back as a television series with the help of Robert Rodriguez. Comment below.